So my place narrative is on the town of Cedar Key in Florida. And this is located off the Gulf Coast of Florida, kind of in the northern half of the state. And you can see here that this is kind of the collection of islands here. So we have Cedar Key, which is where the main town is. It's also technically called Way Key, but everyone just refers to it as Cedar Key. And then collectively, these islands are the Cedar Keys. So that includes Ocina, Snake Key, Seahorse Key, North Key, and then all of these smaller islands. And I also want to point out that there is the Cedar Keys Wildlife Refuge, which is on the mainland of Florida, right on the coast there. So I'm going to go quickly through the history, but you can pause if you want to read it in more detail. I mostly want to point out that in 1854, this is when the industry really took off in Cedar Key, mostly with the cedar mill that was built to supply wood to a pencil factory in New York. And there was also a lighthouse built at this time so that incoming ships, mostly from Cuba, could see their way in the dark. And this industry growth continued until 1886 when everything really fell apart. There was a new railroad built into Tampa, and so the industry was no longer needed from Cedar Key. And there was also a huge hurricane that basically decimated the population there, and they had to rebuild the entire town. And so one of the keys, Ocina, had people living on it, and they moved off of that island after that hurricane. And the wood industry also failed because the hurricane was so bad that there weren't enough trees left to sustain the industry. But this is a photo of what the cedar mill looked like when it was working, and here are those cedar planks being stacked up. This is also what the town looked like in 1884. So this is the Way Key settlement. And then this is Ocina, had a little town there as well. Going into the 20th century, they began more fishing and oystering, but the oysters were mostly exhausted by 1909. So the oyster populations have really fluctuated up and down. So oystering didn't completely stop in 1909, but they had already exhausted the population at that time within less than a decade. And then they mostly used fishing to sustain the population until 1995, when large-scale net fishing in inshore areas was banned in Florida. And so at that point, their resources were severely limited for the residents, and a government retraining program began teaching Cedar Key residents how to farm clams. So this is what the fish house and oyster house looked like in the early 1900s. And then today, clamming is the major industry, and there are 702 residents as of 2010. So I want to frame this within the O'Neill, Holland, and Light kind of framework of from, with, and in the environment. So I'm going to begin with from. This is things that we use from the environment, resources to sustain ourselves, and the main ones in Cedar Key right now are fishing, and then kind of the two of oysters and clamming, although today it is mostly clamming. So with fishing, there are many species. This is really just a handful of the species that are present, but this is a huge draw for tourism. So people come to the island to go fishing because they can catch these crazy fish, and it also does feed the residents who can fish there. But the bag limits keep things pretty tightly regulated. Like the bag limit for grouper is 2 fish per day per person. If you look at the right corner there, you'll see a little video of a shark before we move on. That's a black tip shark. So there's lots of cool stuff. And then oysters are kind of the other big thing that has sustained the Florida population, but they've really been in decline over the past 150 years, and that is partially due to humans and partially due to environmental factors. So there's been huge hurricanes that have really devastated the oyster population. They just kind of get wiped out if a big enough hurricane comes along. There's also fluctuation in freshwater flow. The oysters, at least these species, do need fresh water to survive, and so usually that comes in rivers, but depending on rain flow or freshwater regulation. And then there also is definitely the factor of over-harvesting, and a lot of that is due to illegal harvesting, because currently there's only a few bays in Florida where oyster harvesting is legal, but there is continued illegal harvesting that is just detrimental to the population. And oysters are a keystone species. They're really essential for water quality. They filter out a lot of toxic chemicals, and so we need them to be in Cedar Key. And so for that reason, the oyster harvesting has pretty much stopped in Cedar Key. So in 1995, the government retraining program for clam farming began. And I want to point out that this is really an economic substitution. Clams do not fill the same role that fish do or that oysters do, but they do supply economic prosperity for the residents of Cedar Key, and so they're important in that way. And so that has really been the switch. You can see here, this is oysters, and then here are the clam farms. And I also want to point out that this switch to clamming is really a failure to manage natural resources and maintain the economy using public goods. So oysters and fish are all public goods. Those are common resources. Anyone can go out and get oysters or get fish, although the legality of that now is in question because of how detrimental that has been to the populations. But those are not privately owned resources. But this switch to clams has switched the economy over to private goods because of that failure to maintain public goods. And so now the fish, or the clams, are, you have to take a training course to be able to farm them, and those clam farms are privately owned by the people who harvest the clams. So this is a video of clam farming in Cedar Key. So you can see this is the farms out in the water, and they're pulling up this bag of clams. So they've been growing those clams for about 2 years, and then they go into these buckets, and then they take those clams back to be sorted. So this is the bag that they're grown in. They're put out into the water in those bags and then delivered to a processor, and this is what the processor looks like. So they sort them there and put them in bags to sell. And then this is the clam hatchery. So the baby clams are grown here until they're large enough to be put out into the farm area in the ocean. So now switching to talking about inn. So this is kind of more of the historical aspect, the communal and social aspect of living in the environment. And one thing I want to talk about is the historic lighthouse at Seahorse Key. So again, this was used in the 1800s. It wasn't really in use for very long, and then it wasn't maintained. But recently they installed a new light that is a replica of the old light, and it actually works. So now there's a working lighthouse, and you can see in this video that's what the light looks like when it comes on. And it moves back and forth so that you can see the light from all directions. So this would have been used for ships coming in from Cuba, for example. So, and then I want to talk about with. So how are we living with the environment? I think Cedar Key has a really interesting sort of back and forth between the environment, of taking things from the environment and giving things to the environment, and then also having the environment take and give things from humans. So there's this research and conservation going on, but there's also devastating hurricanes that have completely wiped out the town multiple times, and so it's a really interesting thing that goes on there. So we have the Wildlife Refuge, which was founded in 1929. That mostly is for bird conservation, but they do other things as well. Seahorse Key is a collaboration between the refuge and the University of Florida and Santa Fe College, and that's where the lighthouse is. They do a lot of school outreach to the rest of the state, and then in 2015, the University of Florida put the Nature Coast Biological Station there, which does continued research and conservation efforts, and now they have sort of a long-term standing there. Recently, one thing the university has been doing is this living shoreline restoration. So I will show you this video. This is to help with preventing erosion, and you can see that this grass is growing. This is more natural state of the shoreline. This grass was kind of just has been harmed by hurricanes and human activity, but they're bringing back that more natural state to protect the coast. And then in this video, my dad talks a little bit, which I did not ask him to do, but I think it's useful. So
Here we are at the Living Shoreline Project, built by the University of Florida, meant to stabilize shorelines and protect civic infrastructure with green strategies that also improve fish and wildlife habitat. This shoreline was planted almost 2 years ago and is flourishing.
So that has been a successful impact of the university to bring back that native shoreline. And then there's also the aspect of hurricanes, which have been devastating to humans. So this is a photo from the 1896 hurricane that destroyed the entire settlement at Odi. This wall is completely missing, and this is the hurricane activity since the mid 1800s. So it's been trending up recently, and that is probably due to climate change. The hurricanes have been getting more intense. They've had several really bad ones in the past 20 to 30 years. The most recent severe hurricane was Hurricane Hermine in 2016. This building is right on the coast there, and it was just completely destroyed. They had to take that down. This is the biological station, which had only been built a year before. The ocean is not supposed to be up here. It's completely flooded. And this is actually my dad standing in the flood. This is the day after when they were trying to do cleanup. So the good thing is that the community really came together after this hurricane and they recovered pretty quickly, but everyone who lives on the island lives knowing that they could have a devastating hurricane any year. So in conclusion, it's a really beautiful island and set of islands with many natural resources, and I think it's a really interesting place to study human interactions with the environment because there is so much give and take between humans and the environment. I also think that in recent years they've done a better job of resource management and their conservation efforts have improved. So I hope that because of that, the island will be able to remain this way for many years.